Of course, not everything is. I mean, there are some issues today that we didn't have before. The first thing is now we live in an information environment. Information and knowledge, I think, are the two main variables in today's world. The factory of the late 19th century, early 20th century has been replaced by the information industry, and that's why we have giants such as Google or Microsoft or Apple that are really large international companies based here in the U.S., but they have a, they reach all over the world. So we are in a global community, and it's easier again to read news or newspapers or magazines or research from other parts of the world. In the past, it was almost impossible. It took such a long time just to get a newspaper or a magazine or a photograph or a book from, let's say, from Australia or from even from England. And it was impossible to get information from parts of Africa and Latin America. Today, we are all connected. We are in a global community, in a global economy. So I can read immediately what is happening in Australia, or what is happening in Japan, or what is happening in South America. And I can get a research published in China, or in England, or in France, or in Australia, New Zealand, etc. So we are in a global community, and that's why I have pointed out many times that even though we may have a small library in terms of a physical space in our town, because we can be connected to so many resources in the world, we cannot think anymore like, we have this small library with this small collection. Our holdings, our own holdings, may be small, but we can connect to the World Wide Web, and that will imply that we have access to infinite information resources. So there's not anymore a small library. But that brings about what we call in information and library information science, we call the information overload or overload. Meaning that the problem today sometimes is not lack of information, but the problem becomes having too much information. We are connected almost 24 hours a day. If you have a computer, if you have a connection to the internet, if you have a cell phone or a tablet, you may be connected to the information world 24 hours a day. And I don't know how that's going to affect our brains or our behavior, but I know in my case I have to control my kids, because they want to be connected all the time, because they get a lot of information, a lot of entertainment in the World Wide Web. Because now they don't only can read stuff, they can play games, they can watch television, they can talk to their friends, they can communicate through social media, they can listen to music, they can watch YouTube videos, etc. So it's a world that it's out there, that it's all the time, that we want to be connected to it all the time. I had the experience last year when I had to travel, and I wasn't taking my cell phone because actually the international rates are very expensive. Well, the first few days I felt like like I was missing something, that the world wasn't that I was missing what was happening around the world, and I felt very uncomfortable. It was after 2 or 3 days or 4 days, 5 days without being connected to the internet that I started to relax, to feel okay, that nothing was going to happen. But the first 2 or 3 days were like, oh my gosh, I need a connection. I need to be connected to the World Wide Web to see what is going on. So we have become dependent on on being connected. We feel like we need to be connected, or we'll be missing something, and that's part of the information overload. Also, in terms of our world, our academic world, we have to be very careful in terms, or our professional world as librarians, we have to be careful in what sources are we citing, or what sources are we providing to our patrons, because today it's so easy to publish anything in the internet, in the World Wide Web. That doesn't mean that it wasn't true before, and there are many journal articles or books that are that have misleading information or misinformation. That was true before, but now it's easier. So if we only use Google search, we get tons and tons of information sources that may or may not have any value. So our professional ethics today have become in evaluating the information source before we offer that information to our clients or our patrons. Of course, it's not a matter of censoring any type of information, because we have to treat our clients, our patrons, as citizens, as adults, if they are adults. The idea here is being able to offer our professional opinion on what we consider a best source, and then let the patron decide that if she or he wants to use what we have recommended as professionals. The other issue with this information environment, with this global community, of course, is what we call, also in library and information science, the digital divide. And that means that there are some groups of people that either don't have the means to connect to the World Wide Web, or they don't have enough education to use a computer. So they probably don't, many people, not in the US and also in every part of the world, because of lack of education or lack of economic status or or age. That's also a consideration. Like my mother, for example, she and my aunt, they don't understand anything about computers. They don't know. They still don't understand what the internet is, or what the World Wide Web is. And even though I have tried to explain that to them, they don't see any use for it. They are almost 90 years old. So there's a digital divide right there, and that's due to the age. Okay. But also in some places, let's say in Latin America or in Africa or in Europe or here in the US, there are some places that don't have any connection to the World Wide Web, and they don't know how to use it. They don't have emails. It's very hard. It's hard to believe that is happening, but it is. So if there are some services that are only offered through the internet, through a website, a government website, etc., many of these people who don't have the expertise or the knowledge, or don't have a connection, they are left out of this information environment. And here is where the library is so important, because we have to provide, and we do provide, computers, and we provide connections to people who may or may not have that connection at home, or may not have the skills. So we as librarians have another ethical duty to teach our patrons how to use the internet, how to use a search engine, how to use a browser, how to open an email account, how to use email, and how to use social media, or how to search for news, or anything they want to know, or they need information. So that's another thing that we have to concentrate our efforts in this age that we're living, in this age, in this information and knowledge age. Okay, so we still have the the traditional functions, but we have to add more functions. So the first one is to evaluate information sources, and the second one is to make sure those who are less fortunate can use the internet and or the World Wide Web to their advantage. So those two functions are pretty new. I think they may be 20 years old at the most. Okay, so this is very, very, very important for us as professional librarians. So what is the internet? The internet, as I said, is a hardware. It's networks connected by telephone lines, cables, digital optic networks, communication satellites, etc. And of course, we can think about a network from the very beginning. Here we have the PC or the computer or the tablet or the cell phone. Then we have a local area network, and some of you may have a local area network at your home, and that's when you connect either wireless or with a wire. Several computers with output and input devices. An example of an output device, of course, is the printer or the screen or the speaker, and input devices are scanners, a keyboard, a mouse, etc. So you may have your own local area network at home or at work, and then you may have a gateway to the World Wide Web. Okay, then there are, this is a way to organize the networks. We have a wide area network, then we have regional networks, and then we have national and international, and we call it the superhighway. Of course, this is one way to think about this phenomenon called the internet or the World Wide Web, which the World Wide Web is what we actually see. It's not the hardware, it's not the computer or the connections or the wires or the satellites, but what it is displayed and what we listen in our computers, tablets, and cell phones, and other devices too. Some history about communication technology, of course. We have Samuel Morse, we have in 1844, we have the telephone in 1876. So that's late in the 19th century. Then we have, of course, in the 20th century, we have the first computers, really large, huge computers. We have the first bug that actually was a computer, but was a real bug, was a moth and it's there. You can see it there, and you can search in the internet about that. It's very interesting. Now, of course, now when we talk about a bug, we don't talk about a real bug. We talk about some instruction, some digital instruction, electronic instruction that went wrong. We have this first satellite by the Soviet Union in 1957. And of course, we have the ARPANET, the ARPA and the ARPANET. That was the first computers that have 3 or 4 nodes, and they were able to communicate with each other. And that wasn't that long ago. That was in 1969. The University of Santa Barbara, Stanford Research Institution, UCLA, and the University of Utah were involved in this project. And so that was in 1969. I was already born. I was a little kid. I didn't know anything about this stuff. But it came to me, like I said at the beginning, when I first saw the first computer was in 1978, first personal computer in 1978. I was learning to program in Fortran 4. I don't know if anybody knows what Fortran 4 is or was. I don't know if it's still somewhere being taught. It's a computer programming language, very primitive. We have to use like those IBM cards, and you have to punch holes in it, and then you would run the program in the mainframe. But I saw the first personal computer. It was huge. I only have like 8K of memory, and it didn't even have a floppy disk. You were able to save some instructions in a cassette tape. Many of you, I'll bet you don't know what a cassette tape is, but they were very popular until a few years ago to record music. Okay, and that's how this first computer that I saw. It was very expensive. That's the way you save. What little you could at the time, like with only 8K of RAM memory. Imagine that. But things have changed. Then came Apple and the PC and Windows. Of course, at the beginning, the operating systems were all command-driven. Not like today. Everything you have to learn a command to save or to move a file from one location to another, etc. So it was very primitive if you compare it with what we can do today. Basic, that was another programming language. We had the first bulletin boards. I remember participating in one of those in the early 1980s, I think in 1982 or 83 when I was at the university. But they started in 1978. It was only text, and there was no color or no sound, no videos, not any animation, etc. But it was the beginning of the revolution. I think this is a revolution. What we are living today, it's a revolution that started, in my opinion, in 1969 with the ARPA network. Then came the Macintosh and the mouse, and it was a beautiful computer. It was very tiny. It didn't have colors, but it was the beginning of what we have today. I think I remember when the first time I saw a Macintosh, I was so amazed by that computer. I couldn't afford one because they were really, really expensive. Nowadays, you can find a really nice computer with probably $200 or $300. In the late 70s, early 80s, you need thousands of dollars to buy a computer. And Apple experimented with a very powerful computer called Lisa, Lisa, and that was I was able to see one, and it was, I don't know how expensive it was, but it was in the thousands of dollars, like $10,000 or $12,000, and that's when Apple almost went bankrupt. It came back later with the Macintosh, which was a Lisa, a smaller Lisa, and a little bit less expensive. I don't know how much it was at the time, probably like $2,000. But Lisa was an amazing computer that make Apple went bankrupt. This is a novel about a hacker, and was one of the first novel about computers and about this world, and it has many words that we use today that are used in common language. So please go on the internet and search a little bit about the Neuromancer and read it if you wanted to. Then we have, of course, this special network created for science. We have the American Online that I don't know if it's still around. I was never a member of it, but many people were, and they love it. And I think I don't even know if it's still around. It was a sort of a, I don't know, it was like you have to subscribe to them, and you pay a fee, and they index information for you and provide a lot of information and provide a lot of resources for you that they took out of they index from the World Wide Web. Now with the browsers and with the search engines, I don't know. if that has any importance or not. And of course, now in what we call the World Wide Web, and this is what we see. This is documents or of different formats. It may be music, it may be sound, it may be video, it may be animation, etc. They are interconnected, okay, by links of hypertext. That's what we call the World Wide Web. That's what we see. And that's what has created the revolution that we are now. Of course, now we are going into more social media, etc., etc. So I think this is an overview of what the internet and the World Wide Web is, and how I think we have to think about how it has affected our profession. And I think that's what it is important about this. And that's why I see now, I see this in the last 20 years, that we have two main functions now. The first function is, like I mentioned, the one about being able to evaluate the best information sources. And the second one is to educate people and help people using the World Wide Web. Okay. And to me, those are the two most important things that we can do today as librarians. The profession of librarians have evolved. Okay, in the very, very ancient times, the first libraries were there to preserve, to conserve, probably things like religious artifacts or religious writings or records, or even things from business records and transactions and so on. And the libraries were there to preserve, to organize that information and to preserve that information. Then the libraries became a place to preserve the cultural record of a society. But very few people used libraries in the past, because very few people knew how to read or write. So only those scholars or high priests or public officials, and even some of them, were able to use and access a library. They were closed buildings. They weren't open to the public, because the public didn't know anything about writing or reading anything. Then came, and this is an American idea, I think, the library as part of the educational system. And how the libraries were there to educate people, to show them what it was, good things to read, to make them more civilized. Then in the 1960s and 70s, the mission of the library changed again, and it was more like what we think today as a library, as a place where it's not only you go not only there to learn, but also to entertain yourself. We have open stacks. We let the people in. We let the children in. We let them play. It's a new library. And now, in the last 20 years, with the electronic world, with the digital world, with the global society in the information era, now we have a new library. A new library with plenty of information sources, many ways to search for information. Even in our homeworks, you always tell me about, I can find all the answers using Google. Yes, you can. That's fine. But we have to learn how to use other specialized resources too. Because that is what distinguishes us professionals from those who are our patrons. They are not informational professionals. We are information professionals. Therefore, we have to provide a better service. And one way to provide a better service is using more specialized, more technical information sources that are in an electronic format, and evaluating information sources that we may find in the open internet. Okay, so the function of evaluation of information has become one of the main functions of the professional librarian. because anybody can search in the internet. Even if you don't have a internet or connection at home, you can go to the library or you can go to the university and log into one of the computers, public computers, and browse the World Wide Web. However, you don't have the skills to evaluate the information. So we have to get proficient in evaluating of information, and we're going to get into that later in this semester. But that, to me, that's very, very important, and it's a key. The other key, of course, or the other function is education. Okay, we have to make sure that we educate people to use, to make good use, proficient use of the World Wide Web. Okay, thank you.